The woods were never silent, not truly. Even in the dead of a Southampton night, beneath a sky salted with indifferent stars, there was the scuttle of life and the sigh of the wind. But to Nat, the sounds had begun to curdle. The chirrup of crickets was no longer a song, but the ticking of a cosmic clock. The hoot of an owl was not a warning, but a confirmation. He stood now, a silhouette against the rough-hewn planks of his meeting place, a place that was less a church and more a wound in the earth, hidden by live oaks draped in Spanish moss like tattered funeral shrouds. The air was thick, warm, and heavy with the scent of pine resin and damp soil. Inside, the men waited. Hark, whose shoulders could carry the weight of a mule but whose eyes carried the weight of a people. Will, the fury barely contained. Sam, Nelson, Henry. They were not a congregation tonight. They were an instrument. Nat's fingers traced the worn leather of the Bible in his hands. He did not need to see the words, they were etched behind his eyes, written in fire. He remembered the first vision, not as a memory, but as a splinter lodged deep in his soul, a battlefield in the heavens, light against dark, and a voice that was not a sound but a seismic pressure in his bones, telling him the time was not yet, but to be ready. He turned to face them. The only light came from a single, guttering tallow candle, its flame painting their faces in shifting masks of amber and shadow. It caught the sweat on a brow, the white-knuckle grip on a farm tool-turned weapon, the terrified resolve in a dozen pairs of eyes all fixed on him. The Book of Ezekiel. Nat's voice was low, a river of gravel flowing in the dark. It did not command the room, it consumed it. Thus saith the Lord God, smite thy hands together and let the sword do its work twice, nay, thrice. It is the sword of great slaughter that encompasseth them. He let the words hang, a spectre in the close air. He saw one of the newer men, a boy really, shiver, his gaze darting towards the door as if he could see through the wood to the sleeping world outside, a world of whitewashed houses and soft beds, a world that breathed on their suffering. I have seen the signs you have seen, Nat continued, stepping forward, his own shadow looming monstrously on the wall behind them. The sun, the great lamp of the Lord, extinguished at midday. What does a man call that? An oddity? A trick of the air? He leaned in, the candlelight hollowing his cheeks. It is a hand, passing over the face of God. It is a final mercy, a darkness for us to move in. The last silence before the trumpet. From the forest, a lone wolf cried, a sound that was less an animal call and more a rending of the fabric of the night. It was answered by another, closer. The men stirred. Hark's jaw tightened, his hand resting on the haft of an axe. Nat's eyes moved from one face to the next, binding them with his gaze. They think this is their land. They think we are part of its soil, to be tilled and broken. But the Lord does not see their deeds. He sees ours. And he has given us our purpose. He closed the Bible with a soft, definitive thud. The sound was as loud as a musket shot in the tense quiet. The time for prayer is done, he whispered, the words carrying a chilling finality. Now comes the answering. The memory of his own beginning was not his to hold, but it was a story woven into him, a prophecy whispered on the breath of his mother, Nancy, in the close, hot dark of the cabin. She was a woman stolen from a kingdom that no longer existed, her eyes holding the old knowledge of signs and portents. When her labor pains began, they said the very air in Southampton County grew still and heavy, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. She did not cry out, they said, but bore the agony with a grim, knowing silence, her mind turned inward to a vision only she could see. And when he emerged, slick and new into the world of the enslaved, it was not as an ordinary child. He was born with a caul, a thin, veiny membrane covering his face like a shroud, a thing of powerful superstition among the Gullah and the Igbo alike. It was a sign, a mark of a seer, one destined not for the grave but for a profound and turbulent life. But that was not all. As his mother cleaned him with hands that were calloused from the field but gentle with her firstborn, she found the marks. Not the simple birthmarks of any infant, but peculiar, deliberate patterns etched into his skin, discolorations that to the overseer's eye would be nothing, but to her, schooled in the symbols of a lost world, were as clear as printed words. They were the markings of a prophet, she would later insist, her voice a low, fervent chant as she recounted the tale to him in the deep of the night, her words painting a destiny that was far larger than the boundaries of the Travis farm. She told him that he would never be suited for the life of a slave, that the yoke would never sit comfortably on his shoulders because a greater purpose was carved into his very flesh. She prophesied that he would grow to be a man of words and of spirit, that he would speak with more than just his own voice, and that the world, for all its brutal, crushing weight, would one day have to listen. This knowledge became the bedrock of his being, the first and most fundamental truth he ever knew. It was a secret history written on his body, a divine contradiction to the bill of sale that defined his monetary worth. From his first breath, he was set apart, a child marked not for the field, but for a reckoning, a truth that grew with him, fed by his mother's unwavering certainty, a quiet, smoldering ember in the relentless darkness of the quarter, waiting for the wind of faith to fan it into a world-consuming fire. The world of the Travis farm, with its stark lines of cotton and the ever-present shadow of the whip, began to feel like a pale and fleeting dream. The true world, the one that pulsed with meaning and divine intent, was the one that opened to him in his visions. It began not with a sound, but with a silence, a profound, swallowing quiet that fell upon the boy Nat as he stood at the edge of a sun-dappled field. The coarse shouts of the overseer, the groans of the oxen, the rustle of leaves, all of it was vacuumed away, leaving only a hum in the air that was not of the earth. Then, the light changed. The familiar Virginia sun did not set, but its gold bled away, replaced by a cold, ethereal luminescence that cast no shadows. The sky above tore open, not to a heaven of pearly gates, but to a vast, star-dusted plain where two great hosts were arrayed. They were spirits of light and spirits of darkness, their forms shimmering and indistinct, yet their conflict was terrifyingly real. He saw the white spirits, their radiance cold and sharp as polished steel, and the black spirits, their light a deep, warm, and smoldering glow, like embers in a forge. They were locked in a battle that was both silent and deafening, a clash of wills that shook the very firmament. Swords of pure energy met in flashes that would have blinded mortal eyes, and he knew, with a certainty that bypassed his childish understanding, that this was not a battle of good versus evil, but of oppression and liberation, a war for the very soul of creation. He was not merely an observer, he was a point of focus. The battling hosts seemed to pivot around his small, still form in the field. A voice, which had no source and was felt more than heard, a pressure that resonated in his marrow and vibrated in his teeth, spoke to his spirit. It did not use the language of the overseer or the preacher, but a tongue of pure knowledge that translated itself into his own understanding. It showed him that the conflict in the heavens was a reflection of the one on earth, that the chains on his wrists were part of this cosmic struggle. The voice did not command him to act, not yet. It was a revelation of his nature, a confirmation of the marks on his skin and the prophecy of his mother. It told him to be ready, to watch for the signs, for the time was not yet ripe, but the harvest of justice was coming. As suddenly as it began, the vision collapsed. The celestial plane folded in on itself, the warring spirits faded, and the sounds of the farm rushed back in, a bird chirping, a dog barking in the distance. He stood, trembling, his hands clutching at the rough cloth of his shirt, the world around him now seeming flimsy and false, a mere scrim over the deeper, more terrible reality he had been shown. He was not just national. He was a thing anointed, a vessel chosen, and the quiet fields of Southampton were merely the stage upon which a divine drama was destined to unfold. The gift arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet, dangerous courtesy. In the shaded confines of the main house, away from the brutal arithmetic of the fields, the master's son saw a quickness in the boy Nat, a sharp and hungry light in his eyes that intrigued him. It was a project, a diversion, or experiment in benevolence that felt no more consequential than teaching a clever parrot a new trick. And so, letter by letter, sound by sound, the world of written language was laid bare before him. The squiggles on a page, which to most of the people he knew were meaningless scratches, began to cohere into sounds, then words, then ideas. It was a key turning in a lock he never knew existed. The Bible was the text, its thick, creamy pages and dense, black print becoming his entire universe. At first, the lessons were simple, a recitation of the peaceful passages, the verses of turning the other cheek and the meek inheriting the earth, the very scriptures used from the pulpits of white preachers to weave a theological cage for his people, to preach a gospel of docility and patient suffering in a world of earthly torment for a heavenly reward. But Nat's mind was not a passive receptacle, it was a forge. He consumed the words, but he did not digest them as intended. His intellect, sharpened by his mother's prophecies and his own celestial visions, began to dissect the holy text with a subversive precision. He read of Moses, the deliverer, standing before the Pharaoh of Egypt with the unwavering demand, "Let my people go." He read of the judges, Gideon, Samson, Deborah, who took up sword and spear to smite the oppressors of Israel at the direct command of the Lord of hosts. He read the blood-drenched Psalms of David, crying out for the shattering of teeth and the breaking of the spear against the wicked. He saw in the Old Testament not a distant history, but a living, breathing blueprint for divine justice, a God who was not only a shepherd but a general, a God who sanctioned holy war against those who held his children in bondage. The peaceful Jesus of the Gospels did not erase this vengeful God. For Nat, he completed him, offering a promise of spiritual salvation that made the risk of earthly violence not a sin, but a sacred duty. The words on the page became a weapon, each verse a whetstone on which he sharpened his resolve. Literacy had not tamed him, it had armed him. It gave him the language to frame his rebellion not as a mere act of desperate violence, but as a biblically sanctioned, divinely ordained mission of deliverance. He was no longer just a slave who could read, he was a prophet who could interpret, and in that interpretation, he found the moral and theological authority to answer the voice from his visions, to prepare for the terrible, glorious work of becoming the Pharaoh's foe, the Samson of Southampton, the sword of a righteous and furious God. The air that February afternoon had been unseasonably warm, a false spring that coaxed sweat from the brow and a sense of unease from the soul. He was in the fields, the red clay soft under his feet, when he first noticed the birds. They fell silent, all at once, as if a single, unseen hand had stifled every beak in Virginia. The light, a moment ago bright and clear, began to soften, not with the gentle gradient of evening, but with a sickly, yellowing tint, as if the world were being viewed through a jar of ancient honey. He stopped his work and looked up. A creeping, granular darkness was eating the sun. It was not the deep, star-speckled black of night, but something far more sinister, a bruise spreading across the face of God, a void of pure nothingness consuming the source of all light and life. The world plunged into a twilight that had no business existing at midday. The temperature dropped sharply, and a cold wind, born from the unnatural dark, snaked through the fields, raising gooseflesh on his arms. Around him, the others cried out in fear, their voices thin and panicked in the eerie gloom. Some fell to their knees, praying to a Jesus they hoped would save them. Others simply stared, mute with a primal terror, as chickens went to roost and the world turned upside down. But Nat stood perfectly still, his head tilted back, his eyes fixed on the black spot in the sky. This was no mere astronomical event to him, it was a punctuation mark in the divine sentence he had been reading his entire life. The voice from his childhood vision roared back into his mind, not as a memory, but as a present command. This was the final sign he had been instructed to await. The black spot was the seal on his commission, the celestial warrant for the terrible work to come. It was God's hand, pulled across the sun, granting them a cloak of darkness from which to strike. The fear that gripped the others did not touch him. Instead, a cold, terrifying certainty settled in his bones, a feeling as solid and immovable as the earth beneath him. As the light slowly began to return, a thin, tentative sliver at first, then flooding back with a shocking suddenness, the world tried to right itself. The birds began to sing again, tentatively. The others rose from their knees, laughing with a nervous, relieved hysteria, chalking it up to a strange trick of nature they would speak of for days. But Nat looked at the returned sun, now blazing with its ordinary fury, and saw only a countdown. The heavens had delivered their final, unambiguous message. The time for waiting, for watching, for interpreting, was over. The eclipse was the lifted veil, the last mercy, and the signal for the sword of great slaughter to be unsheathed. The air in the deep pine woods was cool and carried the scent of damp earth and decay, a world away from the sun-scorched fields. They came not as a crowd, but as shadows, slipping between the great trunks one by one, their movements silent and furtive. Hark arrived first, his massive frame moving with a surprising lightness, his eyes, usually downcast, now sharp and alert in the moonlight that filtered through the canopy. Then came Will, the fury in him a palpable heat, then Sam, Nelson, and the others, trusted men, their faces set in grim masks, their hands calloused from tools they would soon exchange for weapons. Nat stood before them, a still and dark figure against the gnarled bark of a great oak. He did not speak immediately, letting the silence and the weight of their collective risk settle upon them. When his voice finally came, it was low, stripped of the cadence of the preacher and instead carrying the flat, hard tone of a field commander delivering a battle plan. He spoke of the eclipse, not as a wonder, but as a command. He recounted the visions, not as dreams, but as divine intelligence. He laid out the scripture, not as a comfort, but as a mandate for a terrible and swift judgment. He told them of the blood that would be required, that the firstborn of Egypt were a symbol for every man, woman, and child who upheld the system of their bondage, that the Lord had called them to be his sword, and a sword did not question, it only cut. He saw the fear in their eyes, the flicker of doubt, the innate horror of the precipice upon which they stood. But he also saw the resolve, hardened by years of lash and insult and the slow, grinding theft of their lives. He met each man's gaze, binding them not with a plea, but with an unshakable certainty that this was not murder, but sacrament, not rebellion, but fulfillment. He asked for their loyalty, not to him, Nat, but to the God of armies who spoke through him. One by one, they gave it, their voices whispers of steel in the dark. Hark's low rumble was the first, a vow that shook the air. Will's was a sharp, eager hiss. The others followed, their assents weaving together into a single, chilling oath that hung amongst the pines, a covenant sealed not with a handshake, but with the shared understanding that there was no turning back. They were no longer slaves plotting escape, they were an army consecrated for a holy war, their souls sworn to a purpose that would drench the soil of Southampton County in blood, and the quiet of the forest became the silence before the storm. The first breath of violence is always the coldest, a shard of ice in the soul that never fully melts. They moved through the pre-dawn darkness, a phantom column led by Nat's unwavering sense of purpose, their footsteps muffled by the soft dirt of the path they knew too well. The Travis house emerged from the gloom, a silent, sleeping structure that represented the entire world they had been born into, a world of unthinking authority and casual cruelty. There was a moment of suspension, a collective intake of breath as they stood at the edge of the yard, the tools in their hands, axes, hatchets, a broadaxe, feeling alien and impossibly heavy. This was the threshold. To cross it was to burn every bridge back to the life they knew, however wretched that life had been. Nat's voice was barely a whisper, a scripture from Ezekiel on his lips, a final anointing for the bloody work. Then they were moving, a surge of pent-up fury and divine mandate. The door gave way with a splintering crack that tore the fabric of the night. What followed was not a battle, but a swift and brutal execution. The darkness inside was split by the arc of an axe, the sickening thud of metal meeting flesh. There were cries, cut short, the gurgle of a life ending, the stark, metallic smell of blood flooding the close air. Joseph Travis, the man who held the deed to their bodies, was dispatched before he could fully comprehend the world turning upside down. Nat stood amidst the chaos, not as a participant in the slaughter, but as its orchestrator, a cold conductor ensuring the terrible symphony proceeded as prophesied. He watched his men, his disciples, their faces transformed from fear into a grim, focused rage. This was the baptism. The first hot blood that sprayed across their hands and faces was a corrosive sacrament, washing away the last vestiges of the slave mentality, searing into them the irreversible nature of their covenant. The horror of the act was the price of their freedom, the necessary first fruit of a harvest of vengeance. As they emerged from the house, their breaths pluming in the chill air, they were no longer the same men who had entered. The quiet of the returning dawn was now a lie, a thin veil over the reality they had just forged. They had crossed over. They had looked into the abyss and become the very thing the white world feared most in its secret heart, not property, not children, but men of judgment, and the long night of their retribution had only just begun. The momentum was a physical force, a current of righteous fury that carried them from the Travis homestead, their numbers swelling as they moved, a dark tide gathering force. The taste of initial success was metallic and potent, a heady wine that made the impossible seem within grasp. They had become an instrument of God's will, and the world, for a few fleeting hours, had bent to their hand. The next objective was clear, a name whispered in their strategic planning, Parker's farm, and then, crucially, the county seat of Jerusalem with its armory, a trove of muskets and powder that would transform their band from a grim procession into a true, unstoppable army. But as the sun climbed, bleaching the horror from the sky and revealing the stark reality of their situation, the first fissures in their divine momentum appeared. The pace, once swift and sure, began to slow. The need to recruit, to gather more hands and horses, to stop and methodically clear each new homestead along their path, became a chain on their ankles. Precious minutes, then hours, were consumed in these deliberate, almost ritualistic acts of recruitment and destruction. The element of surprise, that fragile ghost which had been their greatest ally, began to dissipate with each passing moment. Nat, who had moved with the certainty of a prophet in the dark, now felt the first, cold trickle of earthly concern. He was a reader of celestial signs, not a trained general, and the brutal calculus of military tempo was a language he had not been taught. The men, fueled by a thirst for immediate vengeance and the spoils of cheap whiskey found along the way, began to lose the sharp, fearful edge of their initial purpose. The campaign, conceived as a lightning strike, was devolving into a bloody procession. At a crucial crossroads, a debate simmered. Some felt the pull of Jerusalem, the siren call of the guns that would secure their power. Others argued for securing their rear, for bringing every last soul in the surrounding farms into the fold, fearing betrayal or attack from behind. In that moment of hesitation, of fractured purpose, the rebellion's trajectory was irrevocably bent. The decision was made to continue the methodical work of the morning, to ensure their ranks were full before the final, decisive push. It was a logical choice, a prudent choice, but it was a mortal wound to their cause. With every stop, every life taken, every moment spent, the alarm was spreading ahead of them, carried by riders on fast horses along back trails they did not know. The white militia was not a vision in a dream to be outwitted, it was a practical, gathering force, and the time they had bought it with their delay would prove to be the very thing that sealed their fate. The holy purpose was being slowly strangled by the mundane necessities of war. The first real sound of their approach was not a cry or a gunshot, but the low, steady drumming of hooves on hard-packed earth, a sound that grew from a rumor to a thunderhead. As Nat's band, now a ragged column of liberation and vengeance, moved down the lane toward the key bridge that was their path to Jerusalem, the world ahead of them seemed to solidify. Where before there had been only isolated farmsteads and panicked flight, now there was a line. It was a rough, hastily assembled formation of men on horseback and men standing firm behind fence posts, but it was a line nonetheless, a stark, human wall between them and their destiny. The sun glinted not on the polished steel of scythes and axes, but on the long, cold barrels of muskets and the worn stocks of hunting rifles. The air, which had been thick with the smoke of their purpose and the coppery scent of their justice, now grew thin and sharp with a new, alien smell, the acrid tang of gunpowder waiting for a spark. The divine fury that had shielded them, that had made them feel invincible in the close-quarters chaos of the homesteads, evaporated in the open space of this confrontation. Here, there were no dark corners from which to spring, no sleeping faces to smite before they could scream. Here, there was only distance, and in that distance, the cold, impartial eye of the rifle sight. A voice, raw with fear and hatred, shouted from the militia line, a command to halt, to disperse, to surrender. For a moment, the world held its breath. Nat could feel the certainty of his followers waver, their faith in his divine protection meeting the physical, undeniable reality of organized, armed resistance. Then came the first shot. It was a flat, conclusive crack that tore the silence to pieces. It was not immediately followed by a volley, but its effect was instantaneous. The spell was broken. The belief that they were an unstoppable instrument of God was punctured by that single, lead ball whipping past them or perhaps finding its mark in one of their number. The return fire from his own men was sporadic, desperate, the wild discharges of fouling pieces against the disciplined aim of men who hunted these woods every season. There was no celestial army descending to shield them, no parting of the militia ranks by an unseen hand. There was only the brutal, simple arithmetic of violence, and for the first time, the equation was turning against them. The momentum, that sacred force he had ridden since the first blow fell at Travis's, reversed itself in an instant, becoming a terrible, invisible weight pushing them back, scattering their resolve, and transforming their holy crusade into a desperate, failing battle for survival. The single, defiant crack of the militia's gunshot did not just break the air, it shattered the very idea of their invincibility, and with it, the fragile unity that had bound them. The divine current that had flowed through them, connecting each man to Nat's terrible purpose, short-circuited in a shower of panic and raw, animal survival instinct. The line, which had been a focused instrument of wrath, dissolved in an instant into a chaos of individual terror. The sight of their own fallen, writhing on the ground or lying still, was a more potent sermon than any Nat could ever deliver, preaching a brutal gospel of mortality. The militia, sensing the rupture, pressed its advantage, their shouts now confident, their gunfire becoming more coordinated. There was no order to their retreat, only a frantic splintering. Some men turned and ran back the way they had come, seeking the false sanctuary of the woods they had just left drenched in blood. Others broke to the sides, scrambling over fences and plunging into thickets, hoping to lose themselves in the labyrinth of the countryside they knew so well. A few stood their ground for a few moments longer, firing wild, hopeless shots before the overwhelming reality forced them, too, to choose flight. The army of liberation, God's own sword, was being dismantled before his eyes, not by a superior heavenly force, but by the earthly, practical logic of superior firepower and organization. The voices that had sworn oaths in the deep pine woods were now raised in isolated cries of pain and fear, their unity replaced by the singular, desperate imperative of self-preservation. Nat's commands, once obeyed without question, were lost in the din, his authority rendered meaningless. He was no longer a prophet leading a host, he was a man watching his revolution disintegrate into a dozen separate, frantic escapes. The shared purpose that had made them more than the sum of their parts was gone, leaving behind only a collection of hunted individuals, each alone with the consequences of their actions. The bonds of their sacred covenant were proven to be as fragile as thread against the sharp edge of mortal fear. The woods, which had been their sanctuary and their meeting place, now became a chaotic map of solitary flight, each man a lone animal fleeing the hunters, the collective dream of a new order dying in the thickets, replaced by the simple, primal need to see another sunrise. The world had shrunk from a landscape of divine mission to the damp, confined space of a hole dug between the roots of a fallen pine, the air thick with the smell of rotting wood and his own fear. The cacophony of the hunt was all around him now, the distant baying of hounds, the sharp, excited shouts of white men on horseback, the occasional, chillingly close crack of a gunshot that was not meant for him, but for some other poor soul caught in the tightening net. The mantle of the prophet felt like a rotten shroud, a useless weight in this new reality of flight and hiding. He was no longer General Nat, the sword of the Lord, he was a fugitive, a rabbit in a briar patch, his divine purpose reduced to the animal instinct to breathe, to remain unseen, to live through the next moment. He moved only under the cover of the deepest night, a ghost slinking from one remembered hiding place to another, a dank crawlspace beneath a barn whose owner he had once known, a snake-infested section of swamp where the water was black and stagnant, the cramped loft of a sympathetic soul who risked everything for a crust of bread and a gourd of water passed to him with trembling hands. Each daybreak was a sentence, forcing him into a paralyzed stillness, listening as the world of men who owned the daylight searched for him. The visions had stopped. The voice that had guided him was silent, leaving him alone with the memory of the blood and the screams, the faces of the men he had led to their ruin. Had he misinterpreted the signs? Had the pride of being the chosen one blinded him to a more subtle message? Or was this, too, a part of the divine plan, this humiliation, this reduction, this final, solitary waiting? He did not know. All he knew was the feel of the cold earth against his cheek, the taste of his own thirst, and the sound of the dogs, their baying sometimes fading, sometimes growing so near he could hear the rustle of their bodies in the undergrowth. He was waiting, but he no longer knew for what. For a final, clarifying sign from a silent God, for the courage to rise up one last time, or simply for the inevitable crack of a twig under a boot heel, the rough hands that would drag him from the darkness into the brutal, clarifying light of retribution.